The ranch emerged from the snowfall like a skeleton clawing its way out of a grave. Weathered boards hung at angles that defied physics. The barn roof sagged under the weight of accumulated ice, and the main house stood with windows so fogged and cracked they looked like cataracts on blind eyes. I stood there in boots 2 sizes too large, purchased at a thrift store in Billings, staring at what was supposed to be my inheritance. The Montana wind cut through my second-hand jacket like it was made of paper. Behind me, metaphorically and temporally, the gates of Mountain View Reform School still clanged in my memory. 18 months of cinder-block walls, fluorescent lights that hummed like angry wasps, and the constant vigilance required to survive among kids who'd been hardened by circumstances I could barely comprehend. I'd gone in at 17 for a string of stupid decisions involving a stolen car and a judge who'd finally run out of patience with my excuses. I came out 3 weeks ago at 19 with a high school equivalency diploma, $400 in gate money, and the unexpected news that my Uncle Raymond, a man I'd met exactly twice in my life, had died and left me his Montana ranch. The lawyer's letter had been waiting at my mother's apartment, forwarded 3 times before it found me. My mother hadn't spoken to me since the sentencing, hadn't answered my letters, hadn't visited. The apartment had been emptied. Neighbors said she'd moved to Arizona with a new boyfriend. The only thing waiting for me was that letter, handed over by a suspicious landlord who clearly wanted me gone. Raymond Hollister had been my father's older brother, estranged from the family for reasons nobody bothered to explain to a kid. The will was simple. I inherited the ranch, free and clear, along with whatever remained in his bank account after final expenses. That turned out to be $16,347. The lawyer had seemed almost apologetic when he'd handed me the cashier's check, as if he knew it was simultaneously a fortune and nowhere near enough. I'd spent the gate money and $347 getting here. A Greyhound bus to Billings, a night in a motel that smelled like cigarettes and defeat, the thrift store expedition for winter gear, and finally a ride with a livestock hauler who'd taken pity on me at a truck stop. That left me with exactly $16,000, a property that looked like it was auditioning for a horror movie, and a Montana winter that the trucker had cheerfully informed me was expected to be one of the coldest in 40 years. "You picked a hell of a time to start ranching," he'd said, dropping me at the end of the long driveway. The county road had been plowed, but the drive itself was 3 feet of packed snow and ice. Most folks with sense wait until spring. I didn't tell him I didn't have until spring. Didn't tell him that the reform school counselor's final words echoed in my head every night. "Statistically, you'll be back within a year." Most of them come back. Didn't tell him that this ranch, broken and brutal as it was, represented the only chance I had to prove that I could be something other than a statistic, a case file, a cautionary tale. The walk up that driveway took 20 minutes. My feet broke through the snow crust with every step, and by the time I reached the house, my jeans were soaked to the knees and my toes had gone numb. The front door wasn't locked. Out here, apparently, locks were an afterthought. Inside was somehow colder than outside, the kind of cold that settles into a building's bones when it's been empty too long. I found the electricity still connected, a small mercy. The heat, when I located the ancient thermostat and cranked it up, groaned to life with sounds that suggested it might explode at any moment. Nothing exploded. Instead, a faint warmth began to trickle from vents caked in dust, and I allowed myself the first full breath I'd taken since arriving. The house was a time capsule of a life lived alone. Uncle Raymond's furniture was sparse and practical, a couch with springs visible through worn fabric, a kitchen table scarred by decades of use, a bedroom with a mattress that smelled like mothballs and old man. No photographs on the walls, no personal effects beyond a drawer full of bills and ranch records, meticulous in their detail, documenting years of gradual decline. I spread those records across the kitchen table that first night, a single bare bulb overhead casting harsh shadows. The ranch was 200 acres, mostly pasture, with water rights to a creek that ran along the northern boundary. Uncle Raymond had run cattle, never more than 30 head, selling them each fall. The numbers showed a man scraping by, making just enough to cover property taxes, basic maintenance, and his own minimal needs. The final entries from 2 years ago showed the last of the cattle sold. After that, just outgoing expenses, electricity, property taxes, nothing more. He'd been 73 when he died. Heart attack, the lawyer said, found by a neighbor who'd noticed the mail piling up. No service, no funeral, cremated and scattered somewhere in the mountains, according to instructions he'd left. A man who'd arrived at the end of his life with nothing but land, and a nephew he barely knew. I tried to sleep that first night on the mothball mattress, wrapped in a sleeping bag I'd bought at the thrift store, listening to the wind howl around the house's corners and feeling the building shudder with each gust. The reform school had been many things, most of them terrible, but it had been warm, climate-controlled, predictable. This was different. This was exposure in its rawest form. They said I'd never make it out. The guards, the counselors, even some of the other inmates who'd been through the system multiple times, they all had that same look, that knowing smirk that said, "You'll be back." They always come back. Surviving reform school had required learning to be small, to be invisible when necessary, to show no weakness, to trust no one. Those were skills for survival inside walls. But Montana didn't care about any of that. Montana would freeze me solid if I didn't figure out how to meet it on its own terms. The ranch wasn't asking me to be tough or streetwise or invisible. It was asking me to be competent, resourceful, and stubborn enough to last until spring. As dawn broke across the snow-covered pastures, painting everything in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful given the circumstances, I made myself a promise. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about proving the counselor wrong or showing my absent mother that I could amount to something. This ranch, broken as it was, had been Raymond's last act. He could have sold it, could have left the money to anyone or no one. Instead, he'd left it to me. Maybe he'd seen something in our brief meetings that I couldn't remember. Maybe it was just the desperate act of a dying man trying to keep something alive after he was gone. Whatever his reasons, he'd given me something more valuable than $16,000. He'd given me a last stand, a chance to face something bigger than myself, harder than anything I'd survived so far. The wind picked up again, rattling windows in their frames, reminding me that Montana winter was just beginning, and I was standing in its crosshairs with nothing but determination and a slowly dwindling bank account. They said I'd never make it out. But I'd survived worse than their expectations. Now it was time to see if I could survive this. The full scope of the disaster revealed itself slowly, like a body giving up its secrets to a coroner. Each day brought new discoveries of failure, decades of deferred maintenance coming due all at once. The morning after my arrival, I started a systematic inspection, notepad in hand, trying to quantify the overwhelming task ahead. The barn came first, if only because it was the largest structure and therefore the most immediately threatening. The roof hadn't just sagged under snow weight. Entire sections had rotted through, leaving gaping holes that let in wind and precipitation. Inside, the stalls were buried under years of accumulated debris, broken tools, moldering hay, the skeleton of a tractor that looked like it hadn't run since the Reagan administration. Mice had colonized every corner, their droppings thick on every surface. Birds nested in the rafters, their white droppings painting abstract patterns on the floor below. I stood in the center of that barn, turning slowly, and felt something very close to despair. This wasn't repair work, this was archaeology, excavation, the kind of project that required contractors and crews and budgets that counted in 6 figures. I had $16,000 and 2 hands that, despite 18 months of reform school labor details, were still relatively soft. The fences were worse. Walking the property lines took most of that first week, trudging through knee-deep snow, following the rusted barbed wire as it sagged between posts that had rotted at ground level. Entire sections had collapsed. Others leaned at drunken angles, held up by nothing but habit and frozen ground. Uncle Raymond must have stopped maintaining them years ago, and the Montana weather had shown no mercy. Every broken fence post represented money I didn't have. Every section of rusted wire was a calculation I couldn't afford. The notebook filled with estimates that grew more depressing with each entry. Fencing materials, $3,000 minimum. Barn roof, impossible to estimate without professional consultation, but certainly more than I had. House repairs, where to even begin? The house itself was a catalogue of benign neglect transforming into active threat. The plumbing worked, after a fashion, but the pipes ran along exterior walls with insulation so degraded it was basically decorative. On the third night, I woke to the sound of running water and discovered a pipe had burst in the bathroom, sending a steady stream cascading down the wall. I managed to shut off the main water valve, but not before several gallons had pooled on the floor, seeping through to the crawl space below. That repair took 2 days and $400 in materials from the hardware store in town, 40 minutes away by the truck I didn't own. I hitchhiked, spending nearly 6 hours on the roadside in sub-zero temperatures, thinking about how every unexpected expense carved another piece from my rapidly dwindling resources. The windows were single-pane affairs, installed probably in the 1950s, offering about as much insulation as plastic wrap. Standing near them, I could feel cold radiating inward like they were made of ice. The heating system, ancient and inefficient, ran constantly, driving the electricity bill to levels that made my stomach clench. At this rate, I'd burn through my inheritance before March, but it was the emotional weight that threatened to crush me more than the physical challenges. Every broken board, every crumbling foundation stone, every rusted implement felt like an accusation. This ranch had been Raymond's life, and he'd let it decay around him. Had he been depressed, sick, simply too old and tired to fight anymore? The meticulous records from earlier decades showed a man who'd cared deeply about this place. Something had broken in him, or maybe he'd just been broken by the endless grinding work of keeping a marginal ranch afloat in an economy that had no use for small operators. Walking through the property felt like walking through a ghost's regrets. The old corrals still stood, though the gates hung askew on broken hinges. The tack room in the barn held saddles so dry-rotted they'd disintegrate if anyone tried to use them. In the house, I found photo albums tucked in a closet, pictures of a younger Raymond with cattle, with horses, with what might have been friends or neighbors. His face in those early photos carried something approaching contentment. By the later photos, sparse and poorly composed, that light had died. I understood that look better than I wanted to admit. I'd seen it in the mirror during my worst days in reform school, when the walls seemed to close in, and the future looked like nothing but more walls, different locations, same cage. Raymond had been imprisoned by this place just as surely as I'd been imprisoned by concrete and steel. The difference was, he'd chosen it. Or had he? Had circumstances trapped him here year after year, until leaving became impossible and staying became a slow death? The metaphor was too obvious to ignore. The ranch's decay mirrored my own wasted years, the broken fences like broken relationships, the rotting barn like rotting potential. Rebuilding this place meant rebuilding myself, and I had no idea how to do either. On the 8th day, I hit bottom. I'd been trying to patch a section of the barn roof, working from a ladder that swayed alarmingly with every movement. The wind picked up, temperatures dropped, and my fingers went numb inside my gloves. I dropped a hammer, watched it tumble off the roof and disappear into a snowdrift. Climbing down to retrieve it, my foot slipped on an icy rung, and I fell the last 6 feet, landing hard on my back, the wind knocked out of me. I lay there in the snow, staring up at the grey sky, unable to breathe, wondering if this was how it ended. Not with dramatic failure, but with a stupid accident, dying alone in the snow because I'd been too stubborn to admit this was impossible. When my breath finally came back in a painful gasp, I didn't get up immediately. I just lay there, letting the cold seep into my back, thinking about reform school's warm bunks and regular meals. The counselor had been right. Most of them came back. Not because they wanted to, but because the world outside was harder than the world inside. At least in reform school, someone else made the decisions. Someone else bore the responsibility. Out here, every failure was mine alone. But then, so was every small victory. Nobody had forced me to fix that burst pipe. Nobody made me climb that ladder or walk those fence lines. These were choices, my choices, and that was something I'd been denied for 18 months. The right to fail was also the right to succeed, and I'd forgotten what either felt like. I pulled myself out of the snow, retrieved the hammer, and climbed back up the ladder. My hands shook, my back ached, and I accomplished almost nothing before darkness forced me inside. But I'd gotten back up. That counted for something. That night, I revised my approach. The notebook of overwhelming repairs got set aside in favor of a new list. Things I could do immediately, with the materials at hand that would make a tangible difference. Seal the worst window gaps with plastic sheeting. Insulate exposed pipes with foam and duct tape. Clear the barn of debris to assess what could be salvaged. Focus on survival first, restoration later. The ghost of Raymond's regrets still haunted every corner of this property, but maybe, just maybe, I could honor his memory better by refusing to let this place die completely. He'd held on as long as he could. Now it was my turn. The inheritance wasn't just land and money. It was a test, a challenge, a question. Could I be the person this ranch needed, even if I'd never been that person before? I didn't know the answer yet, but I was still here, still trying. For now, that would have to be enough. Montana winter didn't arrive gradually. It descended like a judgment. By mid-December, 2 weeks into my tenancy, the thermometer outside the kitchen window regularly showed temperatures in the negative teens, and that was before wind chill. The heating system, already pushed beyond its capacity, began making sounds that suggested imminent catastrophe. My electricity bill for that first partial month arrived like a threat. $340 for 2 weeks of use. I did the math in my head constantly, obsessively. $16,000 minus the plumbing repair, minus hitchhiking expenses, minus materials for window sealing, minus the electric bill, minus food, minus gas for the chainsaw I'd bought third-hand from a classified ad. Every subtraction felt like losing blood, watching the number that stood between me and complete failure shrink day by day. The chainsaw became my most vital tool. The property had deadfall timber scattered across the back acres, and wood heat was my only hope of surviving winter without bankrupting myself on electricity. I spent hours each day cutting, splitting, stacking. My hands blistered, then calloused. My shoulders and back developed a constant ache that never fully subsided. The work was brutal, repetitive, and absolutely necessary. I learned to read wood like a language. Dead pine burned hot, but fast, requiring constant feeding. Hardwoods, when I could find them, provided longer-lasting heat, but took tremendous effort to split. Wet wood was useless, so I built a crude-covered area near the house for drying. Everything was improvisation, trial and error, learning through failure. The wood stove became the heart of the house. I'd found it in the basement, an old cast-iron beast that Raymond must have replaced with the central heating decades ago. Installing it in the living room was a nightmare of lifting, positioning, and running stovepipe through a wall in a way that probably violated every building code in existence. But it worked. More importantly, it ate wood instead of expensive electricity. With the wood stove running constantly, I could turn the central heat down to barely functioning, just enough to keep pipes from freezing. The house developed a geography of temperature zones. The living room, where the stove roared, reached almost comfortable. The kitchen, adjacent, stayed tolerable. The bedroom and bathroom became places you visited briefly and fled quickly. I took to sleeping on the couch, wrapped in every blanket and sleeping bag I owned, feeding the fire every few hours through the night. Sleep became fractured. measured in 2-hour increments between wood feedings. I'd wake in the dark, cold air on my face and force myself out of the nest of blankets to load more wood. The fire's glow was hypnotic, almost companionable. Sometimes I'd stand there longer than necessary, just watching the flames, thinking about nothing and everything. Water became a daily crisis. The well worked, technically, but the pressure tank in the basement had developed a leak I couldn't afford to properly repair. I rigged a system of buckets and emergency shutoffs, checking it multiple times daily. One morning, I discovered the leak had gotten worse overnight, flooding a corner of the basement. Another $200 in repairs, another chunk of my diminishing reserves. I started washing dishes in snow melted on the wood stove. Started limiting showers to once every 3 days, heating water in pots rather than running the expensive electric water heater. Started making one trip to town serve multiple purposes. Grocery shopping combined with hardware store runs, combined with library visits to use the free internet. The truck problem remained unsolved. Hitchhiking in Montana winter ranged from difficult to life-threatening. I stood on the roadside for hours sometimes, watching vehicles pass, wondering if this would be the day nobody stopped and I'd freeze to death trying to buy groceries. Eventually, I connected with a neighbor 3 miles down the county road, a woman named Sarah, who ran a struggling horse boarding operation. She agreed to give me rides in exchange for occasional labor, and I became her unofficial fence repair specialist. Sarah was the first person I'd really talked to since arriving. Probably in her 50s, weathered and tough, she had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd survived enough Montana winters to stop being impressed by hardship. She asked no questions about my past, which I appreciated more than she could know. The reform school experience had left me hypersensitive to judgment, always waiting for the moment when people learned the truth and their friendliness evaporated. "You're Raymond's nephew," she'd said when I first approached her about rides. He was a good man, quiet, kept to himself, but decent, helped me out a few times when I was in a bind. That small piece of information felt like a gift. Raymond hadn't just been a recluse letting his ranch decay. He'd been a neighbor, someone who'd helped others despite his own struggles. It made the inheritance feel less like a burden and more like a responsibility to honor. Through Sarah, I learned the rhythms of rural Montana life, how neighbors helped each other not out of charity, but out of mutual necessity, how information traveled through informal networks of gossip and observation, how a reputation, good or bad, could define your existence in a community this sparse. I also learned I wasn't the only one struggling. Sarah's horse operation barely broke even. The couple who ran the feed store in town were fighting off foreclosure. The rancher, who occasionally hired day labor, was one bad year from selling out to a development company. Rural Montana was beautiful, harsh, and economically dying. The people who stayed did so out of stubbornness, love, or lack of options. The cold itself became a living adversary. On the worst nights, temperatures dropped into the -30s. The house creaked and groaned, wood contracting, nails popping loose. I wore multiple layers indoors, my breath visible even near the wood stove. Frostbite became a constant threat. I learned to recognize the warning signs, skin going white and numb, the dangerous temptation to ignore it. One morning, I woke to discover the bathroom pipes had frozen despite my precautions. Thawing them required a hairdryer powered by a generator I'd borrowed from Sarah, hours of careful heating, praying the pipes wouldn't burst. When water finally flowed again, I felt like I'd won a major victory, though the experience had aged me by years. The physical toll was relentless. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my body burning calories faster than I could replace them. My face in the mirror grew gaunt, eyes shadowed, looking older than 19 had any right to look. But there was something else in that reflection too, a hardness, a determination that hadn't been there before. Reform school had taught me to endure. Montana was teaching me to fight. Money leaked away despite my best efforts. By Christmas, I was down to $13,000. By New Year's, $12,000. Every trip to the hardware store was a negotiation with necessity. Did I really need that tool, or could I improvise? Was this repair essential, or could it wait until spring? The constant calculus of survival wore on me, infiltrating my dreams, making me wake in the night, doing math in my head. But I was still here, still standing. The ranch hadn't killed me yet, and I was starting to believe it might not. Winter was teaching me lessons that reform school never could. How to be self-reliant, not out of defensive isolation, but out of genuine capability. How to solve problems with limited resources and unlimited stubbornness. How to find satisfaction in small victories, like a warm fire, a repaired fence, a day without catastrophe. The unforgiving embrace of Montana winter was trying to crush me. Instead, it was forging me into something harder, something that might actually survive. The sunrise on January 15th was the kind that made you believe in something larger than yourself. The storm had cleared overnight, leaving the world transformed under fresh snow that glittered like diamond dust in the early light. I stood on the porch, coffee mug steaming in my hands, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. For just a moment, the endless struggle fell away, replaced by something approaching peace. These moments became my anchor. The brutal beauty of Montana winter revealed itself in unexpected ways. A herd of elk moving across the back pasture, their breath steaming in the frozen air. A red-tailed hawk perched on a fence post, surveying its kingdom with regal indifference. The absolute silence of snow falling on snow, a quiet so profound it felt sacred. In reform school, beauty had been rationed, limited to whatever you could see through security glass or during the occasional supervised outdoor period. Here, it was everywhere, free and abundant, asking nothing but attention. I started taking walks in the evening, when the work was done and my body ached too much for more labor. The cold was brutal, but the landscape under starlight was worth every shivering step. The miracles, when they came, were quiet things, small interventions that felt, in my more desperate moments, like the universe deciding I deserved a break. The first came through Sarah. I'd been helping her repair a section of her arena fence, working in exchange for groceries she'd bought when she went to town. As we finished, she mentioned almost casually that her brother-in-law was selling an old truck, a 1987 Ford that barely ran, but might be fixable. He wants $300 for it, she said, which is robbery, but it's got good bones. Transmission's solid, just needs some electrical work and probably a new battery. So $300 was a fortune and a bargain simultaneously. A functioning truck would save me countless hours of hitchhiking, would let me make supply runs without depending on others' schedules. But it was $300 I hadn't budgeted for, another chunk of my shrinking reserves. I bought it anyway. The decision felt reckless and necessary in equal measure. Sarah's brother-in-law, a grizzled man named Tom who smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, delivered it on a flatbed. He stayed for 2 hours, walking me through the electrical issues, showing me what needed fixing and what could wait. Raymond was good people, Tom said as he left. Glad to see someone's trying to keep the place going. Most folks would just sell it off for development money. That was the first time I'd heard that option stated explicitly. Of course I could sell. The land alone was probably worth 6 figures, maybe more. I could walk away with money in my pocket, start over somewhere easier, somewhere warmer. The thought had occurred to me during the darkest moments, usually at 3 in the morning while feeding the wood stove. But every time I seriously considered it, something stopped me. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the promise I'd made to myself that first morning, or maybe it was the growing realization that this place was teaching me things about myself I'd needed to learn. The truck became my mechanical education. I spent evenings in the barn, which I'd finally cleared enough to be functional, working by the light of shop lamps, teaching myself electrical systems through trial and error. The internet connection at the library provided access to forums where amateur mechanics shared knowledge. YouTube videos walked me through repairs I'd never imagined attempting. When the truck finally started, coughing and sputtering but running, I felt a surge of accomplishment disproportionate to the achievement. It was just an old truck, but I'd made it work with my own hands, figured it out despite having no training or background. That mattered. The second miracle came disguised as disaster. A major storm rolled through in late January, dropping 2 feet of snow in 36 hours. The weight collapsed a section of the barn roof I'd been meaning to reinforce, but hadn't gotten to. I discovered the damage after the storm passed, staring at the caved-in section with despair so heavy it was almost physical. Sarah arrived that afternoon with her truck and 2 men I didn't know. "Heard you got hit," she said simply. "These are the Morton brothers. They're going to help." For 2 days, I worked alongside Sarah and the Morton brothers, clearing debris, shoring up the damaged section, installing temporary supports. They brought materials, refused payment, and worked with the easy competence of people who'd handled similar disasters before. By the time they left, the barn wasn't repaired. That would require spring and money I still didn't have. But it was stabilized, safe, functional enough. "This is how it works out here," one of the Morton brothers told me as they packed up. "Someone needs help, you help. Your turn will come to help someone else." I didn't know how to respond to that kind of casual generosity. In reform school, every interaction had been transactional, weighted with ulterior motives. The idea that people would help simply because you were a neighbor, because that's what you did, felt like a revelation. The internal transformation happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it. Somewhere between chopping wood and fixing trucks and patching roofs, I'd stopped thinking about the past quite so much. The constant mental loop of mistakes and regrets and what-ifs that had dominated my thoughts in reform school began to quiet. I still had bad days, still woke from nightmares about being locked in cells, about my mother's disgusted face during sentencing, about the judge's words as he sent me away. But those days were interspersed with good ones now. Days when I accomplished something tangible, when the ranch looked a little less like a disaster and a little more like a project in progress. I started keeping a different kind of notebook. Instead of costs and repairs, I listed small victories. Fixed the gate latch. Cleared the drainage ditch before the storm. Truck ran for an hour without stalling. Reading back through those entries, I could see progress that wasn't visible in any other way. The connection to the land grew deeper. I learned the property's moods, how the wind patterns changed before a storm, where the sun hit first in the morning and last in the evening. I identified animal tracks in the snow, deer, coyotes, once a mountain lion that had passed through the back pasture, leaving prints so perfect they looked carved. The ranch stopped feeling like an enemy to be fought and started feeling like a partner in survival. By February, I'd developed routines that bordered on ritual: morning wood chopping, the rhythmic split and stack, afternoon projects, whatever repair seemed most urgent, evening truck work, the satisfaction of mechanical problem solving, night feedings of the wood stove, those quiet moments alone with the fire and my thoughts. The isolation that had frightened me at first became something I valued. Nobody here cared about my record. Nobody knew about reform school unless I told them. I could be whoever I chose to be, defined by my actions now rather than my mistakes then. That freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Sarah became something like a friend. Though neither of us used that word, she'd stop by occasionally, ostensibly to check on something, actually just checking on me. We'd drink coffee, talk about weather and livestock prices and the economy. She never pried, never asked the questions I knew she must have wondered about. In return, I helped when she needed it, and we maintained a comfortable equilibrium. The ranch was still dilapidated, my bank account still shrank, winter still had weeks to run, and I had no guarantee of making it through. But something fundamental had shifted. I'd stopped seeing this place as a test I was failing and started seeing it as a legacy I was learning to honor. Raymond had held on as long as he could. Now it was my turn. The silent miracles of neighbor help and mechanical triumphs and breathtaking sunrises weren't fixing everything, but they were fixing me. And maybe that was the point all along. The first hint of spring came in mid-March, not as warmth, but as a change in the quality of light. The sun rose earlier, lingered later, and carried a promise of eventual thaw. I stood in the yard, watching water drip from the barn roof, and felt something like hope. The winter had cost me $7,000 in repairs, supplies, and survival expenses. I had $9,000 left, which seemed simultaneously like plenty and nowhere near enough. But I was still here, still standing, and the ranch was better than I'd found it. Not good, not even close to fully functional, but better. The barn roof was patched and reinforced, ready to last another year. The worst sections of fence were repaired, at least enough to be called fences again. The house was weather-tight, the plumbing functional, the heating system limping along. The truck ran reliably, more or less. I'd cut and stacked enough firewood to last through next winter, learning from this year's desperate scrambling. More than the physical improvements, though, was the change I saw in myself. The bathroom mirror reflected someone I barely recognized. Leaner, harder, with hands that were scarred and calloused, with eyes that had lost some of their uncertainty. I looked like someone who belonged here, like someone who'd earned their place through endurance and stubbornness. The spring thaw revealed damage I hadn't been able to assess under snow. Erosion along the creek bank, sections of pasture fence that would need complete replacement, outbuildings I'd barely explored that turned out to be beyond salvation. The to-do list remained overwhelming, but now I had a plan. I'd spent the winter evenings, when I wasn't working on the truck, researching and planning. The ranch couldn't survive as a traditional cattle operation, not at this scale, not with my limited resources. But there were alternatives. Niche markets for organic produce, value-added agricultural products, even agritourism if I was willing to put in the work. Sarah had connections to restaurants in Missoula and Bozeman, places that paid premium prices for locally raised meat and vegetables. The Morton brothers ran a sawmill and were always looking for reliable timber sources. Tom knew every mechanic and welder in 3 counties, and several of them needed help with odd jobs. There were possibilities here if I was creative enough and willing to work harder than I'd ever worked. I drafted a 5-year plan, ambitious and probably naive, but concrete. Year 1, stabilize and secure the basic infrastructure. Year 2, start a market garden, test the soil and climate for what grew best. Year 3, expand into small-scale livestock, maybe goats or specialty poultry. Years 4 and 5, build toward profitability, establish reliable markets, maybe even hire help. It was a dream, perhaps, but it was my dream. Built on this land with these resources, through my effort. Nobody could take that away or tell me I hadn't earned it. The legal paperwork came through in April, finalizing my ownership. I drove to the lawyer's office, signed the documents, and walked out with the deed in my hand. My name on official paper, stating that I owned 200 acres in Montana. A kid who'd been in reform school 6 months ago now owned land. The irony wasn't lost on me. The county clerk, processing the paperwork, had looked at my ID and done the math. "You're young for a landowner," she'd observed, not unkindly. "Inherited it from my uncle," I'd said, which was true but incomplete. "Well, good luck with it. This area needs young people willing to stay and work." And that sentiment came up repeatedly as I integrated into the community. At the feed store, the post office, the diner in town where I occasionally treated myself to breakfast. There was a desperate hope among the long-timers that someone, anyone, would stick around and keep these places alive. The alternative was slow death, towns fading as the young left and the old aged out. I hadn't planned to become part of a community. Hadn't expected to care about more than my own survival. But the people who'd helped me through the winter had earned my loyalty. When Sarah needed help with a difficult foaling, I spent 36 hours straight assisting. When the Morton brothers' sawmill broke down during a critical order, I lent them my truck and helped with delivery. When Tom's wife got sick, I drove him to the hospital in Billings and waited, because that's what you did. These acts weren't transactional. They were reciprocal, woven into the fabric of rural life, creating bonds stronger than any contract. By May, the transformation was undeniable. I stood on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, and actually smiled at what I saw. The barn stood solid, its new roof gleaming in the early sun. The fences ran straight and true, at least the sections I'd prioritized. The pastures showed the first hints of green, promising growth. The house behind me was warm, functional, mine. More importantly, I was different. The nightmares about reform school came less frequently now. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who'd earned his place through sweat and stubbornness. My hands bore the scars of honest work. My body was lean and strong. My mind had found a kind of peace I'd never known before. The $9,000 remaining wasn't much, but it was enough. I had a plan now. Connections, skills I'd developed through necessity. The market garden I'd started was already producing lettuce and radishes. Sarah had orders waiting from her restaurant contacts. The Morton brothers wanted to discuss a timber arrangement. I had options, possibilities, a future that extended beyond simple survival. One evening in late May, I drove to town and bought the deed frame I'd been eyeing at the hardware store. Back at the ranch, I hung it on the living room wall, the official document declaring my ownership of 200 acres in Montana. Raymond Hollister's name was there, crossed out legally, with mine written below. "I'm making it work, Uncle Raymond," I said to the empty room. "It's not pretty yet, but it's getting there." I didn't know if he could hear me, didn't know if he'd approve of my plans or methods, but I liked to think he'd understand. He'd held on as long as he could, fighting the same battles I was fighting now. He'd given me this chance, this last stand, knowing it might break me or make me. It had done both. The person who'd arrived in November, fresh from reform school with $16,000 and no hope, had been broken down completely. But something new had been built in his place. Someone capable, resilient, connected to the land and to a community that had accepted him without judgment. The counselor's words echoed one final time. "Statistically, you'll be back within a year." But statistics didn't account for Montana winters. They didn't measure the strength found in chopping wood at dawn, or the determination forged in fixing frozen pipes at midnight. They couldn't quantify the value of a neighbor's unexpected help, or the peace found in a sunrise over snow-covered mountains. I wasn't going back. Not to reform school, not to my old life, not to being a statistic or a failure. This ranch, with all its challenges and imperfections, had become more than property. It was proof that redemption existed, that people could change, that a broken inheritance could be rebuilt into something worth keeping. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared over the mountains, I sat on the porch, listening to the night sounds of my land. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other. The creek murmured its eternal song. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. I was home, finally, impossibly, completely home, and spring had only just begun.